Welcome, everyone. It is a tremendous honor to be able to give this introduction. Dr. Benjamin Reiss is professor of English at Emory University, a specialist in American cultural history, and a leading scholar in the field of critical sleep studies. In particular, Dr. Reiss's scholarship has been focused on the experiences of people marginalized in categories of health, race, disability, and madness. His notable works include The Showman and the Slave, which examines the experience of Joyce Heth, an enslaved disabled woman exhibited by P.T. Barnum as the world's oldest living person, and Theaters of Madness, exploring the creative lives of patients in 19th century insane asylums. In his book, Wild Nights, Dr. Reiss takes up a key theme of critical sleep studies to identify and understand the impacts of society's desire to control sleep by isolating individuals and limiting their rest within 8-hour blocks. In particular, he considers the ways in which such sleep patterns exacerbate inequalities for marginalized and minoritized persons, who often face significant barriers to restful sleep and experience the negative health outcomes that result. His lecture today, Sleep and Inequality, A History, represents these values and priorities that he has pursued throughout his career. Nobel Conference 60 is excited to welcome Dr. Benjamin Reiss.
Thanks so much, Sean. Oops. Thanks so much, Sean, for that wonderful introduction. I just want to say to my fellow presenters, I'm sure you've all been well hosted, but they gave me the 3 best people, so, I don't know what that says about it. Sean, Christina, and Taylor, thank you so much. It's been great hanging out with you all and getting to know you. Taylor says she told all of her sorority sisters to come today, so are you in the house? If not, we may have to report you to the national chapter, but anyway, this has been great, and thank you to the conference organizers. This has been just a tremendously exciting couple of days for me. I've learned so much, and if I could summarize what I've learned in one sentence from all of these talks, it's that being awake is really terrible for your health, and we should avoid it at all costs. You build up all these poisonous substances in your brain. We should start a society for the prevention of wakefulness, I think is the next step. But I'm really excited to be talking right before Tricia Hersey, and I think you'll, without knowing exactly what she's going to say, I think you'll find that this talk gives a kind of deep historical background for a lot of the issues that she's going to raise, and we've been down some similar tracks in our own work. And the title of my talk is Sleep and Inequality, A History. But one could reasonably take the view that there is no inequality when it comes to sleep. After all, sleep is one of the last freely available natural resources. It's an energy source that's available to anybody who can simply close their eyes and find a soft surface in a relatively quiet place. Or in another way, we could think of sleep as a ghost that haunts each of us equally. In its grasp, even the most powerful and wealthy among us become immobilized, virtually insensate, and vulnerable to all sorts of malefactors and environmental hazards. And we share that not only with other humans, but with other species. So either way, we could think of sleep as a great leveler. As Walt Whitman, the great poet of American democracy, put it in his poem called The Sleepers, I swear they are averaged now, as he looked on a kind of row of sleeping soldiers. One is no better than the other. The night and sleep have likened them. Or as the popular Jamaican proverb goes, sleep has no master. Yet paradoxically, sleep is also a zone of conflict, division, and inequality. Some people have the power to dictate the sleeping patterns and configurations of others. Ask any screaming child who is sent off to bed against their will. Other people lack the means to find restful conditions. Ask any prisoner in a cell, any resident of a city under siege, any person scratching out life in the streets. In the US, the unequal distribution of the resource known as sleep has produced a slew of studies, and many of them are published in this excellent journal, Sleep Health, which is really about sleep and demographics. So looking at different occupations, different social identities, different familial experiences, different environmental factors that all affect access to the conditions necessary for restful and restorative sleep. And one very important factor, which I'll be talking a lot about today, is race, or more accurately, racism. There's been a great deal of research on racial disparities as they relate to sleep health, showing a prevalence of shorter sleep durations, poorer sleep continuity, more severe insomnia and breathing-related sleep disorders among minoritized populations in this country, and particularly black folks more than any other racial group, kind of being vulnerable to these conditions. And as we've heard, poor sleep can then lead to or worsen a whole slew of other health problems like heart disease or diabetes. We learned about neurodegenerative diseases today, and so on. Yet, to my knowledge, there's no scientific study that's revealed a genetic factor that would make one racial group sleep better or worse than another. So the causes must be cultural, social, and environmental rather than inherently biological. So I think this is where the humanities come in. And so welcome to the humanities. We do things a little differently here. If you're Monty Python fans, I would say, now for something completely different. I'm going to give you kind of a history of some of these disparities. But instead of speaking about racial disparities, we really should be talking about disparities that are based on structural racism. And that's a term that's sadly become very politicized today. But it really explains something important, and that is the inequalities that persist even in an officially egalitarian society. Things that aren't necessarily acts of overt discrimination, but might be responses to conditions that are decades or sometimes centuries in the making, and that still persist. History is still with us. And so some of these issues involved in ongoing structural racism include different levels of access to quality schools, different levels of access to credit to buy homes, to get health care, and the like. But lack of access to restful sleeping conditions or heightened exposure to factors that can impede sleep can also be considered an aspect of structural racism. And this is an article that I co-wrote with two epidemiologists and a psychologist, kind of outlining what that would look like in sleep studies research. And that's my book, Wild Nights, and some of what I'm going to be talking about today is drawn from that book, but there's also a lot of new material as well. So, the poor sleep, if there's a population that is experiencing relatively poor sleep, as we can see, it really has cascading effects, and we learned a lot about those as well today, too. So think of a child with parents who work irregular shifts and have difficulty maintaining appropriate bedtimes. Well, this can lead to the child's attentional problems or agitation or dozing off during class, and then that can lead to all sorts of additional problems. Or, think about somebody who's operating dangerous machinery at work on scant rest. In these situations, sleep deprivation can lead to deepening social disadvantage and health problems because of all the additional things that come from it, all of which can worsen sleep troubles in a vicious cycle. And sleep can even, as we learned today, affect the very structure of the brain. So, returning to that quote from Walt Whitman, sleep may average us all, but that's only if we're using the same equation. So to understand sleep's relationship to inequality, we need to understand the context in which we sleep. And I'm going to start with a story from my own life. So in the summer of 2005, I was living with my spouse and two young children in New Orleans. And before going to bed one night, I checked the weather forecast and saw a mounting storm gathering in the Gulf of Mexico. Hurricane Katrina was barreling down on the city. And like other New Orleanians of sufficient means, I quickly planned an escape. And my first thought was finding somewhere we could all sleep in safety, comfort, and privacy out of harm's way. And the nearest place we found out of harm's way was ordinarily a 4-hour drive north in Shreveport. But in the slow motion frenzy of the evacuation, it took us 16 hours to arrive at a chain hotel where we settled into a suite that looked something like this. 2 rooms, heavy drapes, kind of bland but functional decor. And here our kids could sleep in privacy, apart from their parents, more or less at the bedtimes we had worked so hard to enforce, while my wife and I could stay up a bit later, watching the news on TV, anxiously planning our next steps with heavy shades drawn to allow us to recover some of our lost sleep the next morning. This separation of parents, which we were really quite desperate to find a place that would allow us to do it, it's one of the hallmarks of Western European and North American sleep, putting children in a different room from the parents. And it's actually a very strange arrangement historically. Almost nobody thought to do that before about the late 18th, early 19th century, and I'll get into some of that history. But most peoples across the planet and across history would have considered it unthinkable or maybe even abusive to put children apart from parents at nighttime. Nighttime in many cultures is a time for intergenerational closeness and physical contact, but in our society we're taught to prize separation and individuality. But having escaped the eye of the storm, we were able to recreate that scenario that we had taken for granted as middle-class American sleepers. Parents in one room, children in another. New Orleans might be underwater, but bedtimes could be restored. Well, we had plenty to worry about at that time, what would become of our city, our jobs, our kids' schools. But we had connections, we had a reliable car, we had some money in the bank, we had a network of friends and family who could help us get on our feet. I think we knew that as bad as things seemed, we would be all right. In the safety of our hotel, we turned on the television, and some of what we saw emphasized the fragility of our privilege sleeping in comfort, safety, and privacy in the midst of a disaster. So this is a photo of exhausted, frightened people sleeping in the New Orleans Convention Center in the immediate aftermath of the storm. And I've blurred their faces so that you won't, to kind of protect the identity of these folks. Most had probably lost their homes. Few, if any, had the means to flee to safety. Instead, they lay together, huddled, snatching scraps of sleep in the midday light. Children sleeping on top of parents, closely guarding their few possessions in a time of great scarcity of supplies. No walls separating them from other rough sleepers. No heavy drapes to block off the light. Not even the basics of comfort, privacy, or security. You will also notice that the skin tones of these weary citizens are darker than mine. In that context, a comment by a prominent member of a political family, whom I won't name at the time, calls up some of the worst aspects of our history, inadvertently justifying what researchers call sleep health inequities. And this is what this person said, looking at a scene very much like this. So many of the people in this arena here were underprivileged anyway, so this is working out very well for them. This was on, broadcast news, television. This wasn't said in private. This was in an interview with the mic in the person's face. That's what she said. What this callous comment unintentionally acknowledges is that the conditions for restful and healthful sleep in a safe and private space were unequally distributed well before the storm ever hit. As is so often the case with disasters, Katrina just laid those conditions bare for all to see. If parents in this slide feared for their children's safety at night, was that really a new fear for them? If they were exhausted at odd hours, might irregular or uncertain work shifts have made this a familiar feeling? If they lacked privacy and comfort, might some of them have long-standing fears of being evicted and living on the street? How many people in this picture had generational family wealth to help help get them to safety? Probably none, I would guess, or they wouldn't have been trapped in the convention center in the first place. The conditions that led my family to sleep in safety and others in great peril were a long time in the making. What the humanities can offer us in studying sleep or any other human behavior is to deepen our sense of context, including the element of time. Humanities scholars are guardians and interpreters of the documentary record of human experience and expression. The two slides I've shown you are such records, and they have histories, long ones. Those histories involve large forces such as economics, technology, cultural belief systems, and relationships of power. So the rest of my presentation will lay out some of that history as I see it. So I'll begin in the late 18th and early 19th century. We go a long way back to explain what's happening here. A time of immense social, geopolitical, economic, and intellectual change. The period goes by different names. It's the Age of Enlightenment, the age of the Industrial Revolution, the height of the transatlantic slave trade, the age of European colonialism, the age of revolutions. Some recent work in social and cultural history also calls this the period of the golden age of privacy. Pay attention to that word. And one historian calls it the age of comfort, thinking about European history. Two terms that might make us think of sleep. Privacy was a key term debated by philosophers and legal theorists, and it described, and still describes, two distinct but related concepts. The first is a psychological place of security and independence for autonomous individuals. For example, we have a right to privacy. You know, these folks have a right to privacy. And an arrangement of physical space, that's the other meaning of privacy, apart from the public, that allows for solitude and seclusion, like a private carriage or a private house. Comfort was a value that was increasingly sought in the consumer societies of Europe at a time when factories were churning out an impressive array of goods that protected one from discomfort. Everything from umbrellas, which were new in the late 18th, go out in 18th century London and you suddenly have this protection from the rain. But also bedding supplies were like really in vogue in the sort of early part of the industrial age, providing comfort for the masses. But comfort and privacy for whom? And enlightenment and revolution in industry for whom? So the next two slides are kind of difficult ones to talk about, and the second one in particular to witness, but they depict scenes of sleep during the transatlantic slave ship voyages of the 18th and the 19th century. So the first is called Plan of an African Slave Ship. It's a diagram that was produced by the British abolitionist Thomas Clarkson as part of his campaign to gather evidence of the abuses of slavery. And Clarkson showed this image of the slave ship Brooks on his many lectures around Europe beginning in the 1790s, and it was widely reprinted across the first few decades of the 19th century. The diagram looks kind of abstract, almost like a game board, but what it depicts is anything but. Each thick black line going up and down represents an African person who was chained and packed below decks into the tightest space imaginable. Lacking privacy, bereft of comfort, and forced to sleep, or at least to lie down, in the most unsanitary conditions, the enslaved were treated more like cargo than like passengers or even prisoners. Packing prone bodies together so tightly was not only efficient, but it created better opportunities for surveillance and control, which were enhanced by the use of iron chains. And this is another image that was circulated by abolitionists nearly a half century later, which conveys the face of human suffering behind this inhumane arrangement. The image pictures human faces and bodies struggling to snatch moments of rest in a deliberately unrestful environment. Males are chained to other males, part of a deliberate effort to break family bonds that were systematically destroyed under the slave system, and bonds that in many African societies were strengthened by intergenerational sharing of sleeping surfaces. So you not only break up the family, but you chain males together at night. The formerly enslaved activist named Olaudah Equiano, who wrote just a really powerful narrative of his experience, both being captured and subsequently in the New World as an enslaved man. He offered verbal testimony of what it was like to be packed into the ship in this way. He wrote that the apartments of ships in the middle passage were, in his words, so crowded that each had scarcely room to turn himself. The stench was absolutely penitential, with the shrieks of the terrified and the groans of the ill and dying keeping others awake. Slave trader turned abolitionist John Newton, he's actually the person who wrote the song Amazing Grace when he saw the light. He wrote in his memoir, this is what he said: "The poor creatures, thus cramped for want of room, are likewise in irons, for the most part both hands and feet, and two together, which makes it difficult for them to turn or move, to attempt either to rise or to lie down without hurting themselves or each other. Every morning, perhaps, more instances than one are found of the living and the dead fastened together." Just a horrifying, horrifying, hellish scene. During the height of the transatlantic slave trade, sleeping arrangements for European white people were undergoing a transformation that produced the opposite of everything that we've just seen. My next image is taken from Harriet Beecher Stowe's massively popular, an early illustrated edition of her massively popular 1852 novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. The fame of this novel spread so quickly throughout the world that by 1873, it was translated into no fewer than 37 languages. Inspired plays, spin-offs, rebuttals, toys, everything. It's a huge sensation. And the spiritual climax of this classic anti-slavery story takes place in a young girl's bedroom, her private bedroom, a space that was described by the French historian named Alain Corbin as a temple of private life, privacy, comfort. The temple in question is that of little Eva, whose deathbed scene convinces her father to commit himself to Christ and to free those he has enslaved. Unfortunately, he too dies before he can make good on his commitment. But her pious talk of Christ's love for the lowly takes place in a curiously overstuffed room, which takes the notion of comfort to an almost absurd level. The room is described as containing rose-colored and white muslin curtains, a floor mat ordered from Paris, a statue of Jesus on the mantel, marble vases and sculptured angels with drooping wings on the shelves, rose-colored cushions on the bed, and an alabaster writing stand on a book-strewn desk. In a reflection of racial disparities that were often taken for granted in Stowe's day, as in some ways they are today, the novel's principal black character, the enslaved man known as Uncle Tom, sleeps on a pallet in the hallway outside of Eva's bedroom so that he may tend to her well-appointed death. As opposed to the enforced privations for weary Africans aboard the slave ship, Europeans and Euro-descended Americans, like little Eva, increasingly sought refinement, comfort, and privacy in their sleeping as well as waking lives. These values became key components of what Europeans meant when they described themselves as civilized during the 18th and 19th century. Nowhere did bourgeois Europeans and North Americans seek privacy and comfort more than in bedrooms. Domestic spending on bedding increased dramatically from the 16th through the 19th century, enabled by newly available raw materials that came largely from enslaved and colonized labor. Advances in industry yielded ever more comfortable sleeping surfaces in Europe. For those who could afford them, you could buy an iron spring mattress, which was invented in 1840. It caused kind of a sensation. And that amazing product displaced more traditional horsehair or grass-filled sacks that people had slept on previously. It became part of a sort of sleep industry in a way of downy pillows and fancy covers and all of that sort of stuff, drapes for bedrooms. And so the products adorning little Eva's bedroom marked her membership in a growing bourgeois class, as did the fact that she had a room to herself in which to put all these things. The fact that a young girl had a private bedroom seems unremarkable now. But it was an astonishing development in the history of sleep and of family life in general. As the research of Sasha Handley shows, through medieval and early modern Europe, all but the wealthiest families slept in common rooms or hallways that had multiple functions in day and night. But gradually fueled by wealth that was generated by industry, colonialism, and the slave trade, middle-class homes in England grew large enough to accommodate separate rooms for sleeping. And this is an image of a sort of typical middle-class 18th century bedroom. Pretty darn nice. Not super fancy, but it's got, carved bedstead, and it looks like really soft and thick mattress, and, very private space. Got its own fireplace. Bedrooms that were stuffed with sleep-related products like down pillows, sleeping visors, prayer rosaries, candles, later oil lamps, became the chief domestic space associated with Europe's vaunted valuation of privacy. The bedroom during this period became the preferred site, not just for sleeping, but for sex, for childbirth, for prayer, for writing letters, for reading novels, and for dying. From the Enlightenment period to our day, it was the architectural development necessary for constructing autonomous individuals who would learn in their own private space as children, to start separating themselves from families and then go off and make your way in the world. The spread of private bedrooms was also shaped by health concerns. In the dominant miasmic theory of disease was understood to be generated by decomposing organic matter, which could be spread by body fluids that were either soaked up in sheets or that were carried through fetid air. In England, the growth of industrial capitalism attracted the rural working poor into cities where they often slept dozens to a room in crowded boarding houses. And here's one from, I think it's either London or Liverpool, from mid-19th century. In 1842, the pioneering British health reformer Edwin Chadwick reported on such unhealthful practices as multiple families sleeping together in rooms without windows or chimneys, on makeshift beds lacking sheets. And in his view, the result was what he called a dense accumulation of bodies that were not fit for a swine to live in. Drawing on miasmic theory of disease, he warned incorrectly that such sleeping practices contributed to the spread of cholera. But as other kinds of diseases proliferated in boarding houses, the Parliament passed the Common Lodging Houses Act of 1851, which mandated hygienic practices and more private sleeping arrangements for factory workers. In 1861, a British Royal Commission even recommended that each soldier be given his own bed and at least 200 cubits of space. In this context, sleep was often a dividing line between cultures, and this gets to the idea that sleep, it's a common experience, but it can really divide us. European travelers to Africa and other colonized regions frequently reported on sleeping arrangements that they considered primitive. A late 18th century French travel writer hinted darkly of incest among Hottentots in southern Africa, and he wrote, "The savages sleep all promiscuously together in the same hut and are neither acquainted with difference of age nor that invincible horror which separates beings connected by blood." Missionaries in New Zealand, Africa, and Australia and other locations tried to stamp out these co-sleeping practices in order to promote the ideal of Western-style nuclear families. By the mid-19th century, the European ideal of private sanitary sleeping was frequently presented in overtly racial terms. This is something that white people do, and it shows that we're a superior culture. And this is the physician William Whitty Hall, who wrote kind of the best-selling sleep hygiene book of the 19th century called simply Sleep. Went through about 9 or 10 editions. And he said, as men improve in their condition, eventually, instead of several members of a family sleeping in the same bed, each child, as it grows up, has a separate apartment. In contrast, he wrote disparagingly of co-sleeping societies, compared them, in his words, to the vilest and the filthiest of the animal kingdom, wolves, hogs, and vermin who huddle together. And so when we picture the space, the sacred space of little Eva's private bedroom, we have an image of sleep that helped to define a society's self-image. And we maybe have a partial explanation for why Europeans who were committed to privacy and comfort would countenance bringing enslaved people packed into sleeping spaces like sardines. Privacy and comfort were for us, not for them. Wretched sleeping conditions continued once the human cargo reached the New World. The privations of enslaved people on what historians now often call forced labor camps. It used to be called plantations. That sounds kind of pleasant, right? So forced labor camps, these privations are well known. The killing hours in the field, physical punishment to the point of torture, rape at the hands of enslavers, forced couplings in the name of breeding, systematic breakup of familial bonds, lack of access to education, and even penalties against learning to read, and the daily humiliations, both large and small, that came with being marked as a permanently subservient class. But nighttime brought new terrors and privations. White abolitionists and authors of slave narratives frequently described rough sleeping conditions, like being made to sleep in groups on the bare floor, middle of the night interrogations by suspicious overseers. And if you've seen the movie 12 Years a Slave, there's just an absolutely harrowing scene involving that. And cruel punishments for oversleeping as among the most excruciating and regular pains of enslavement. So really, if you read the literature of slavery through this lens, it's an incredibly rich record of catastrophic sleep loss. And of something that we call sleep disparities today. The white reformer Thomas Tryon wrote in 1684, sort of ventriloquizing the voice of an enslaved Caribbean man. He said, "We rise early and lie down late, and labor beyond our strength, whilst our luxurious masters stretch themselves on their soft beds and couches." This is an image of slave quarters in actually one of the more privileged spaces one might find. It is George Washington's Mount Vernon. But you can see that the idea of having private space, of kind of being able to, even to have the comfort of a middle-class room, a mattress and a pillow. There don't seem to be any pillows here. It's just sort of not even conceivable, right? And this is one of the better accommodations. So Frederick Douglass, who's an amazing figure, in his 1855 biography, he wrote several versions of his autobiography, but the 1855 one is the most detailed on this, and it includes a section that he called deprivation of sleep, which he believed to be intentionally induced by his enslavers. And here's part of what he wrote. "The sleeping apartments, if they may be called such, have little regard to comfort or decency. Old and young, male and female, married and single, drop down upon the common clay floor, each covering up with his or her blanket, the only protection they have from cold or exposure." He used the word comfort and decency, and these were watchwords of the master class. They were systematically denied to the enslaved, in part because they were deemed inferior. Depriving them of their own space to rest was also an effective method of round-the-clock social control. I mentioned the interrogations that often happen in the middle of the night. Douglass went on to write that the broken sleep of enslaved people produced a chronic exhaustion that was convenient to their enslavers. And hearing this morning's lecture, I'm thinking about what was happening to the brain and how amazing he would go through this and continue on as an extraordinary orator and writer and public figure. After enduring what he described, he wrote about he was so tired during his off hours that he wandered around in a beast-like stupor, unable to follow through on any of his half-formed ideas about escape. And the historian Walter Johnson refers to such tactics of enforced sleep privation as torture, akin to the will-breaking practices used on prisoners in Abu Ghraib or Afghanistan. And Douglass has account is consistent with that. The stupor that Frederick Douglass describes may have been a useful state for slaveholders to induce in their captors if the goal was to keep them down, but it was a problem in terms of economic activity. Chronically exhausted enslaved laborers lacked the energy to work efficiently. They were prone to accidents, and they could be irritable or lethargic. Yet slaveholders and their apologists explained away the effects of exhaustion as if they were a matter of innate biology. They didn't see racism, they saw race. In 1794, Thomas Jefferson, there's an amazing section of his book, Notes on the State of Virginia, about his thoughts on slavery. Not for the faint of stomach to read it, but he did talk about sleep among enslaved population, and he said, these are his direct words, blacks require less sleep than white people. And he observed, though, something puzzling, which was that enslaved people tended to drop off to sleep as soon as they were done working. But he explained this not by saying they're exhausted, but because of what he considered to be their animal-like constitution. And again, these are his words. An animal whose body is at rest and who does not reflect, engage in high philosophical discussion and so on. An animal whose body is at rest must be disposed to sleep, of course. And so there's no interval. So basically what that meant is work them till they drop. That's how they're built. A half century later, the notorious Louisiana physician Samuel Cartwright went even further, explaining that chronic exhaustion and the propensity to drop off to sleep in the middle of the day were symptoms of a special black disease that he called dysesthesia ethiopica. The cure he proposed, here's the cure for dysesthesia ethiopica: hard work in the open air and sunshine. I think we can find in the ideas of Jefferson and Cartwright one important starting point for the stereotype of black laziness, a trope that spread through the 19th and 20th centuries through popular and political culture alike. Under this quasi-medical rubric, the depressing, exhausting, and soul-killing aspects of enslavement, disenfranchisement, and poverty could simply be interpreted as an aversion to work, inability to control the body's urges, and was evidence of a need for even more discipline and work and labor. So exhaustion due to lack of access to the conditions necessary for sleep were interpreted as a natural propensity to be lazy. It's easy to see from these stories why dramatic sleep disparities opened up between blacks and whites, especially as more white workers attained middle-class status and could afford the comforts of homes with private bedrooms and all the stuff that went in them. But why did the disparities persist even after the abolition of slavery? And that's a big question, and I have maybe one part of one answer. Certainly access to healthful and restful sleep environments continued to be unequal as generations of legal segregation and more insidious forms like redlining perpetuated a divide in access to safe, restful, comfortable, and private sleeping conditions. Living in impoverished neighborhoods also leads to safety risks, difficulty in securing nutritious foods, and proneness to noise pollution, all of which can lead to poor sleep outcomes. Sleep schedules are also disrupted by unfavorable or intermittent work schedules, which also often correspond with racial differences. But I want to suggest that history can teach us about one other possible factor for the persistence of a structural sleep gap, and this one is sort of more of a psychological one as well as a historical one. And a key is in what sleep researchers, which I've learned about, call hypervigilance. And we all know that sleep is an elusive prize when our minds are racing, when we're worried or stressed about an upcoming event, or we can't shake memories of trouble from the day before, or even from years before. What does this have to do with race and with history? In a 2013 article, epidemiologist Margaret Hicken and her team linked poor sleep among black people to a state of heightened vigilance, which she defined as the anticipation of and perseveration about racial discrimination. To be black in America, their respondents report, means mentally preparing for the possibility of experiencing racial discrimination on a day-to-day basis. Not exactly conducive to falling asleep at night. And such racism-related vigilance, Hicken writes, creates, in her words, stressor results in poor health through the overactivation of the biological stress system. Hicken and her team cited one black woman who poignantly summed up a common set of worries. And here's what she said. One problem with being black in America is that you have to spend so much time thinking about stuff that most white people just don't even have to think about. I worry when I get pulled over by a cop. I worry when I walk into a store that someone is going to think that I'm shoplifting. And I have to worry about that because I'm not free to ignore it. On the basis of such reports, Hicken and her team theorized that what they call racism-related vigilance may result in poor health by activating the physiological systems associated with excessive wakefulness. Another of Hicken's respondents made a powerful reference to the history that I've been sketching out when she linked this chronic vigilance to a cultural memory of slavery. And here's what she said. Blacks can't sit back and relax at all. You have to be vigilant at all times. If you don't, you'll be back in chains. This comment was made over 200 years after emancipation. Imagine what it's like to be thinking that way, feeling that way. You make a false move, and that history all comes back to you. But it reflects a painful proximity to that deep history in which even freedom from bondage couldn't produce rest. Frederick Douglass actually talked about this after he escaped. After all the pains in sleep and waking endured during slavery, he probably didn't sleep much better once he escaped to the supposedly free states of the North. The Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 incentivized so-called slave catchers to track down anyone suspected of the crime of liberating oneself from captivity. And here's a poster that is typical of what they would post. It warned black people from to avoid talking to police who they thought were likely in league with kidnappers and slave catchers. And if you can see on the bottom few lines, it says, keep a sharp lookout and have top eye open, presumably even during sleep. Douglass explained what it meant to sleep with top eye open. He said, I've been frequently asked how I felt when I found myself in a free state. I felt like one who had escaped a den of hungry lions. This state of mind, however, very soon subsided, and I was again seized with a feeling of great insecurity and loneliness. I was yet liable to be taken back and subjected to all the tortures of slavery. I was afraid to speak to anyone for fear of speaking to the wrong one, and thereby falling into the hands of money-loving kidnappers whose business it was to lie in wait for the panting fugitive. The motto which I adopted when I started from slavery was this: trust no man. I saw in every white man an enemy, and in almost every colored man cause for distrust. To combat distrust, this kind of distrust, and to protect the fugitives from captors, free black Americans and their allies formed groups called, appropriately enough, vigilance committees, which provided a network of safe houses, assistance with escape routes, alerts about suspected kidnappers, and political and legal efforts on behalf of accused fugitives. The term vigilance means a state of heightened alertness. And these vigilant societies were famous for 24/7 watches, as slave catchers often seized their victims under cover of night. Indeed, Douglass's protector, who was a man named David Ruggles, who's head of the New York Vigilance Committee, suffered severe health effects from his stress and chronic lack of sleep. And after he stepped down from presidency of the Vigilance Committee, he opened a health retreat in New York, in upstate New York, where he promised restorative rest and care to those who fought the good fight. I'm going to just jump over toward the end because I know I'm running out of time here. I did have a poem that I wanted to dwell on by an amazing African-American poet of the 19th century, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, in which she talks about not being able to rest while she imagines that injustice is going on. And it sort of captures this ruminative quality of like, there's so much trouble in the world, I can't sleep, I can't rest, I can't sleep. My only rest is going to be in the grave. And it seems to me that she's describing very much what Margaret Hicken and her team would analyze a century and a half later. Ida B. Wells also alludes to this state of mind in her famous quote, the famous anti-lynching reporter. She said, "Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty." So by that measure, the inequality of sleepers is evidence that the price of slavery and the fragile liberty that followed has not yet been fully paid. When Hicken's respondent discussed her sleeplessness and thought that it was produced by worry about making a false move and winding up back in chains, she may have been voicing an intergenerational trauma rooted in the history of black vigilance. And I'll just add that when I shared this presentation with my students, I'm teaching a class on sleep in science and literature, a student said to me afterward, that explains something that I've heard among older people in my family, which happens to be African American, which is a phrase that they use is, I was born tired. I was born tired. So returning to the Whitman poem I mentioned at the beginning, for all of this history, sleep does have a leveling or democratizing effect. Part of that leveling is that we are all made vulnerable by our passivity and immobility during sleep. We all need protection. We all need to be safe. And not just humans, every species has its ways of defending against the dangers of predators, whether they are slave catchers or lions. Here's one of my favorite strategies, and that's the parrotfish, who spits out a bubble of toxic goo and then sleeps blissfully inside it as sharks and moray eels glide by. Where humans may be unique is in the degree of inequality we have created in distributing our protections during this vulnerable time. What would it take for us all to sleep with the same level of safety, privacy, comfort, and freedom from fear as the parrotfish does? We'll never know unless we face the history of inequities, as well as the present circumstances that reinforce them. Thank you.